When people talk about rent controls, they often follow neoclassical economic theory, which immediately distorts the entire conversation. At first glance, it seems like rent freezes harm the poor by reducing housing supply, but that assumption breaks down once you actually examine highly complex real-world issues. The real issue is not just popular economic models, but rather critical factors, especially when you consider how these freezes did more good than harm elsewhere. This is why critics should rethink how they understand these issues, because the implications extend far beyond the freezes themselves. Before diving deeper, it's important to separate what critics want to be right about from what they're actually wrong about, and recognize how the expectation versus reality shapes the entire discussion moving forward into the analysis ahead. A claim they imply is that it's a perfect market, assuming there will be no problems, but that assumption collapses because everyone knows it's not a perfect market. In practice, this means the positives outweigh the negatives. For example, housing is a standard commodity. When examined further, the argument relies on shelter as an elastic necessity, which is not actually demonstrated. This creates some conjecture rather than proof. If applied consistently, it would also imply that people can simply choose not to consume it. A clearer interpretation is that shelter is an inelastic necessity that people simply cannot choose not to consume, which avoids the issue. Therefore, the original argument does not hold under its own standards. In short, if people must rely on the housing market, consumers should have protections at the expense of renters. Another claim they imply is that there is no immediate risk of eviction, assuming a rent freeze will cause sudden homelessness, but that assumption collapses because freezes actually prevent sudden homelessness. In practice, this means there will be no mass displacement during inflationary shocks. For example, if a renter decides to raise the rent higher than a rentee can afford, they become homeless. When examined further, the argument relies on assuming renters won't do that, which is not actually demonstrated. This creates an absolute trust in the anti-freeze market. If applied consistently, it would also imply that employers should pay their employees more to keep up with the rent hike. A clearer interpretation is the rentee matters more than the renter, which avoids that issue. Therefore, the original argument does not hold under its own standards. In short, rent freezes are better. A third claim they imply is this capital flight, assuming landlords can just easily move, but that assumption collapses because landlords cannot easily move. In practice, this means repurposing physical apartment buildings cannot be done overnight. For example, lease agreements and eviction laws, zoning and permitting restrictions, and building codes and retrofitting make it prohibitive. When examined further, the argument relies on believing landlords have such control over physical supply, which is not actually demonstrated. This creates an idea that landlords have more leverage than they even should. If applied consistently, it would also imply that occupants should carry the burden of landlords without any of the sway. A clearer interpretation is the landlord should carry more of the weight and occupants, less, which avoids that issue. Therefore, the original argument does not hold under its own standards. In short, the landlord's problems are the landlords, not the occupants. A fourth claim they imply is that monopolistic power is noted, assuming such power will be internally monitored and controlled, but that assumption collapses because monopolies get disregarded. In practice, this means occupants get less return for their investments while landlords get more for their occupants' investments. For example, price-fixing cartels. When examined further, the argument relies on lawful agreements between competitors to sincerely control prices, which is not actually demonstrated. This creates an idea that free market supply and demand between rival businesses will not force consumers to pay more. If applied consistently, it would also imply that rival businesses will not collude to raise price levels. A clearer interpretation is that landlords will abuse their occupants, which confronts the issue. Therefore, the original argument does not hold under its own standards. In short, opposing rent controls is supporting abuse. A fifth claim they imply is that it'll respect community stability, assuming that price gouging fosters neighborhood stability, but that assumption collapses because it doesn't. In practice, this means less safe communities. For example, short-term residency. When examined further, the argument relies on more local economic investment, which is not actually demonstrated. This creates a cold shoulder to price gouging. If applied consistently, it would also imply price gouging as a free market strategy. A clearer interpretation is those against rent controls prefer a monopolized corporate housing market worse than company towns in the past, which worsens the issue. Therefore, the original argument does not hold under its own standards. In short, they're corporate loyalists. A sixth claim they imply is that a blanket rent freeze doesn't affect every renter the same way, assuming the market doesn't have built-in safeguards to prevent wealthy people from hogging all the cheap, regulated apartments, but that assumption collapses because landlords and housing authorities check an applicant's income. In practice, this means wealthy applicants are often disqualified from renting these specific regulated units. For example, rent freeze and rent stabilization programs rarely exist in a vacuum. When examined further, the argument relies on wealthy tenants snatching up all the luxury-adjacent apartments below market rate, pushing out lower-income tenants, which is not actually demonstrated. This creates an excuse for landlords to keep abusing their tenants by scaring them into thinking a worse outcome can happen. If applied consistently, it would also imply that it's actually better to abuse your tenants to avoid any other abuse. A clearer interpretation is that it is all abuse, so maybe stop doing it, which avoids the issue. Therefore, the original argument does not hold under its own standards. In short, fear-mongering is just further abuse. A seventh claim they imply is that we should ignore how capping rent will stop a dangerous economic domino effect, assuming landlords will stop maintaining buildings or deter developers from building new housing, but that assumption collapses because there's no example of that happening. In practice, when rent soars, workers go to their employers and demand higher wages just to keep a roof over their heads. For example, if employers grant those raises, their business costs go up, raising the prices of the goods or services, thus raising rent. When examined further, the argument relies on thinking continuous rent hikes won't cause wage price spirals, which is not actually demonstrated. This creates a fear of a loop that will ultimately shrink the housing supply and drive up prices long term. If applied consistently, it would imply that one loop is better than another. A clearer interpretation is these people are ignorant liars, which confronts the issue. Therefore, the original argument does not hold under its own standards. In short, they prefer a worse outcome over a better one. An eighth claim they imply is that there's no alternative supply, assuming public or non-profit housing isn't there to fill in any gaps left by private developers, but that assumption collapses because it creates a false dilemma. In practice, this means private developers leave, the housing supply shrinks, and the housing crisis gets worse. For example, a rent freeze is rarely meant to stand entirely on its own. When examined further, the argument relies on thinking rent freezes aren't designed to be paired with public investment, which is not actually demonstrated. This creates a measurement of a narrow, profit-driven view of the housing market, rather than looking at the entire potential ecosystem of housing supply. If applied consistently, it would also imply that nobody deserves affordable housing. A clearer interpretation is the housing market should be controlled by financial sadists, which confronts the issue. Therefore, the original argument does not hold under its own standards. In short, we're not just listening to stupid people, we're listening to cruelly stupid people. A ninth claim they imply is landlords can automatically abandon buildings, assuming they won't face severe fines, but that assumption collapses because they can't legally do that. In practice, this means landlords will do anything to keep profit margins up. For example, landlords don't operate in a vacuum since they can't just legally abandon a building or stop fixing things because their rent is frozen. When examined further, the argument relies on a rent freeze negating housing codes, which is not actually demonstrated. This creates a misunderstanding about landlords' incentives. If applied consistently, it would also imply that unaffordable housing is actually as good for a tenant as it is for a landlord. A clearer interpretation is that they have no idea how this housing stuff works, which confronts the issue. Therefore, the original argument does not hold under its own standards. In short, they're not fooling anyone except other housing ignoramuses. A tenth claim they imply is that balancing rent regulations has already destroyed the housing sector in cities, assuming they actually had such a thing, but that assumption collapses because we don't have any balanced systems. In practice, this means we haven't tried it. For example, you don't really have such a thing in the United States. When examined further, the argument relies on something that isn't true, which is so very demonstrated. This creates a false view for opponents of rent control. If applied consistently, it would also imply that there's no example of its success. A clearer interpretation is that these people are desperate, which confronts the issue. Therefore, the original argument does not hold under its own standards. In short, these people are liars. To conclude, the claim that rent control harms the housing market does not hold up under scrutiny. When we look at examples, it becomes clear that there are positive examples. Additionally, research further demonstrates the critics are wrong. Even if one argues that the facts are wrong, the evidence from all research says the facts are right. Overall, the most reasonable interpretation is that landlords shouldn't have the control they think they should have, because these landlords are greedy. This matters because rent controls are a stumbling block for the greed. In short, tenants should have protections, and any fair assessment of the housing system must account for those protections. Therefore, the strongest position remains that rent controls are good, not because it is convenient, but because it aligns with the logic and ethics. That is the conclusion drawn from the full analysis above. Any contrary view requires stronger evidence.